So thank you very much for this kind introduction, Dekel. And of course, I would also like to thank the organizers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to present some thoughts on Adorno and democracy today. We are short of time, I guess, so we'll start right away. The necessity of critique, Adorno, and separation of powers and political maturity. Theodor W. Adorno, the writer of Minima Moralia, Dialectic of Enlightenment, or Negative Dialectics, and the most famous member of the early Frankfurt School, is not typically discussed in the context of political and legal theory. Drawing from his insights on maturity, Mündigkeit, and his concept of critique, I want to suggest an alternative to the traditional understanding of Adorno as a critique who has a lot to say on individual and social deformation, but nothing essential to contribute to the theory of democracy. His text Critique, published in 1969, can serve as a good starting point to bring Adorno into the discussion on the value and meaning of democracy. Almost casually, he states in this text that critique cannot only be understood as a human right, but also as a human duty. In the following 15 or 16 minutes, I will focus on these two aspects, critique as a human right and critique as a human duty, and I would like to give an interpretation of what Adorno might have meant by it. In doing so, I don't want to suggest a fixed definition of democracy or critique, but I want to show that these terms require specification if they are not to degenerate into empty signifiers, which are then subject to arbitrary interpretation. So first, I will turn to Adorno's critique as a human right, with which he intends to address the institutional aspect of democracy. For him, especially the dispersal of state authority provides a political precondition for government that can call itself democratic. In his text Critique, Adorno elaborates on this as follows. Not only does democracy require the freedom to criticize and be critical. Can you hear me?
We can hear it.
Okay.
Just wait a second. Anna?
It's going to come.
Okay.
I'll take it off. Yeah? More than Brian?
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. So I quote. Not only does democracy require the freedom to criticize and meet critical impulses, democracy is nothing less than defined by critique. This can be recalled simply in the historical fact that the conception of the separation of powers, upon which every democracy is based, from Locke and Montesquieu and the American Constitution up to today, has its lifeblood in critique. The system of checks and balances, the reciprocal overview of the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary means as much as that each of these powers subject the others to critique and thereby reduces the despotism that each power, without this critical element, gravitates to. By raising the question of the extent to which the dispersal of state authority is a political precondition for democracy, one can say that Adorno understands the separation of powers as a political institutional form of critique. Okay. Against this background, any intention to minimize or even abolish the system of checks and balances can be understood as hostility to critique and tends toward an authoritarian regime in which one branch of the government alone has full power to impose its policies. This is actually done in favor of the executive.
No, we cannot hear it.
Stop.
Slicha?
I think it was better with this one.
Okay.
Send it to the moon 60 years ago.
Yeah.
This,
Okay.
this one,
Okay, so against this background, any intention to minimize or even abolish the system of checks and balances can be understood as a hostility to critique and tends towards an authoritarian regime in which one branch of the government alone has full power to impose its policies. This is usually done in favor of the executive with a result of a Carl Schmittian understanding of politics. But at the same time, and I think this is crucial in order not to fall into a legal formalism, these political institutions, like rule of law, the parliament, separation of powers, and its constraints through checks and balances, should not be idealized. Not only the dramatic expansion of modern administrative state, but also unelected post-national private sector institutions challenge the system of separation of powers. That's why these political institutions and procedural rules should be conceived only in their relationship to the society play of forces, as Adorno writes in Critique. For example, what are the social consequences when governments don't deliver what they promise, when they are unable to improve the lives of the people? What does it mean when the transition from a democratic to an authoritarian state or even dictatorship does not take place through a coup d'etat, but takes place under procedures that are formally considered democratic? With a view to recent developments in liberal democracies, which show an increasing yearning for authoritarian leadership, I will turn to my second point now, critique as a human duty. This part of my talk will be a little bit longer, as I think that promoting a democratic consciousness is one of the most effective means of combating today's anti-democratic tendencies. For Adorno, democracy depends not only on institution, as I've just briefly discussed, but also on the individual, on critical thinking, as to speak on a democratic consciousness. Let me quote again from his text Critique. Critique and the prerequisite of democracy, political maturity, belong together. Political mature is a person who speaks for himself because he has thought for himself and is not merely repeating someone else. He stands free of any guardian. On this point, maturity understood as a duty to think and speak for oneself, Adorno agrees with Immanuel Kant's answer to the question, what is enlightenment? In this 1784 published essay, Kant defines enlightenment as a new way of thinking, a thinking for oneself that includes the capacity to judge. However, Adorno subjects Kant's statement to critical reflection. He subjects Kant's statement to critical reflection. To presuppose an individual capable of thinking and acting in a self-reliant manner, instead of making its absence a starting point of considerations, shows a moment of indifference toward reality that makes it very difficult for most of the people to determine their own purpose in life. In Adorno's view, dealing with the relationship between maturity and democracy rather requires a study of the complex and tense relation between the individual and society. And this includes the question of the possibilities of individual self-determination under current harsh social conditions, conditions that instead of allowing people to actually articulate critique and to speak for themselves, promote conformism, cynicism, or narcissistic bossiness. Rechthaberei. I don't know if it's the correct translation. Taking up this problem 45 years later, Shannon Mariotti, professor of political science at Trinity University, adds the following. How can one argue that liberal capitalism cultivates a passive citizenry and also argue that it's possible today to foster independent thinking and action? In his 1961 essay Opinion Delusion Society, Meinung Wahn Gesellschaft, Adorno deals with the judging quality of having an opinion. The title is without punctuation between the words, and in this way he wants to illustrate the proximity between opinion and delusion as an expression of a refined consciousness. He points out that having an opinion closes itself off from experience and thus excludes communication with others from the outset. The fusion of individual opinions into a single public opinion is not the only problem, but opinion as such, as form. According to Adorno, having an opinion is oppressive in itself. It means to judge, to subsume a particular under self-proclaimed general, and therefore tends to delusion. Moreover, he warns in this article that the alleged normal opinion does not automatically triumph over the delusional one. Pathic opinions, the deformation of prejudice, superstition, rumor, cannot be separated from the concept of opinion. Furthermore, he argues that the dynamic between normal opinion and deformed delusion inheres a real dynamic of society, a dynamic that produces exactly such opinions. He adds, however, and this is quite typical of Adorno, that, and I quote, "After all, only the one who is capable to judge is reasonable. This is perhaps the deepest and most irrevocable contradiction of having an opinion," end of quote. Every thought exhibits a moment of opinion, but for thought to be true to itself, it must not negate it must critically reflect upon itself. Hannah Arendt sees it in a similar way. For her, thinking means that I check my assumption, that I think, I use this word very reluctantly because of the Frankfurt School, but well, critically, and that I do not allow myself to repeat the cliches of the public mood. Despite their quite famous personal animosities, the two share the view that blindly adopting the cliches and judgments of others is tantamount to abandoning one's own thinking. Especially in Germany, Adorno observed this tendency. According to him, the belated arrival of democracy in Germany extended even into the ramifications of mind. Pre-democratic and undemocratic forms of consciousness, in particular a thinking that conforms to authority, have survived in democracy and prevent people from making it their own, he writes in Critique. However, thinking, and this is important to mention, is not to be understood here as a self-talk detached from social reality. Critical thinking is not an exclusive conversation with oneself, but as Arendt pointed out, an anticipated speaking with others. The individual, if he or she wants to communicate, must put his own subjectively formed opinion into a form that others can understand. The ability to communicate thus implies an ability to translate. Imagination, then, is the ability to visit the perspective of others. By incorporating these perspectives, we qualify and validate our judgment, or as Hannah Arendt points out, critical thinking still takes place in solitude, but through imagination it makes the others present and so moves into space which is potentially public and open on our sides. Thus, critical thinking takes the position of Kant's royal citizen. To think with an enlarged thought is to teach one's own imagination to make visits. Bosiness, this form of egocentric monologuing, which cannot hear and ultimately does not tolerate the opinion of others, is not an expression of individuality, but an indication of a lack of a democratic consciousness. The point at which the necessary critique of the existing turns into cynicism or hostility to science is described by Adorno as an expression of an unwavering critical freedom that reminds him of Michael Kohlhaas. Max Horkheimer takes a similar view. Self-centeredness turns the individual into an element of the masses and conformism, not into a critical thinker. Only critical thinking, and understood as self-reflection, can counteract this tendency, which is concretized by Arendt as follows. The art of critical thinking lies precisely not in extraordinary extent and empathy, with the help of which one can know what is going on in the minds of others. Thinking in Kant's understanding of enlightenment means thinking for oneself. This idea is also taken up by Adorno in his aphorism, "Just hear how bad he was," when he asserts that it is not the supposedly immediate encounter with the other, but self-reflection that may help bring about change. Understood as insight that incorporates and keeps present other perspectives, imagination is the expression of a consciousness that can be called democratic. This paves the way for non-egocentric self-thinking, for reflective judgment, and finally creates a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for moral action and solidarity. And that brings me to my conclusion. At the end of his text critique, Adorno complains about an extremely annoying attitude that one formulates critique, one must always also name something positive, otherwise critique wouldn't be accepted. At the same time, a few lines later, he adds the following. In fact, it is by no means always possible to add to critique the immediate practical recommendation of something better, although in many cases critique can proceed by way of confronting realities with the norms to which those realities is real. Following the norms would already be better. What does this mean for us today? In my opinion, it would be very important to strengthen the sense of the political without becoming apologetic. On the one hand, it is a matter of not denying the complexities of today's world, the socially conditioned constraints, and thus one's own limits effectiveness. On the other hand, this must not lead to a fixation on facts that prohibits any thinking about alternatives and consequently condemns us to leave everything as it is. In a radio conversation with Adorno and Eugen Koren in 1953, Horkheimer points out, but one danger is that precisely when people recognize social tendency as super-individual social tendencies, they allow themselves to be deterred from acting at all. I think it is very important that we make it clear to people that this must not happen. It is about creating a right, that is to say, a democratic consciousness, as I've tried to outline here with Adorno, but also with Arendt, that is a precondition for being able to distinguish the good from the bad, the right from the wrong, and the beautiful from the ugly. And according to Arendt, this can indeed prevent catastrophes, and I quote, in the rare moments when the ships are down. Actually, I wanted to close with another quote from Arendt, who thus passes the ball back from the individual to the political decision makers when she emphasizes public rights and private interest. Education is very nice, but the real thing is money. But now I have to, but if I have a minute left, I would like to close with some remarks on a recent election in Germany, as I think it touches on important issues that I have discussed today. First of all, it is worth mentioning that the German Domestic Intelligence Service classifies the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, the far-right party in Germany, especially in the state of Thuringia, as a right-wing extremist. On Sunday, for the first time, this party won the district council election in Sonneberg in an area south of the state of Thuringia. The area of about 57,000 people is one of the smallest districts in Germany, and although Robert Sesselmann, in the position of the district administrator, will carry rather limited power, many of his duties will entail simply implementing laws from either the state or the federal parliament on a local level. Nevertheless, the victory is a major breakthrough with symbolic effect for the far-right AfD, which is currently polling between 18% and 20% nationwide, making it the second strongest party in Germany after the Christian Democratic Union. On the evening of the election results, Katharina König-Preuß, a member of the state parliament for the left party in Thuringia, called on Twitter that it's very important now to support local initiatives that work to counter the normalization of right-wing extremism, support refugees and other disadvantaged people, and promote democratic participation. And as you can see, she's asking for funding and the financial support. And I would like to add that this shouldn't be just a philanthropic private matter, and maybe democracy itself needs to become more militant, as Karl Löwenstein once urged in 1937. Thank you for your attention. Toda Rabba.